Architecture of Hope, a century of horror. It was called the Architecture of Hope, a magnificent palace for the mind, a place intentionally designed to heal with sunlight and soothe with fresh air. It was built on a revolutionary, almost radical idea for its time. That beauty itself, that the very space a person inhabits, could be a cure for the darkest of human afflictions. When the Fergus Falls State Hospital received its first 2 patients on the 29th of July, 1890, it wasn't just a new building being opened. It was a promise, etched in brick and stone. It was a promise of humane care, of what was known as moral treatment, and of a new dawn for those society had labeled mentally ill. This is the story of how that dream, so full of light and good intention, rotted from the inside out. It's the story of how a place of healing twisted into a prison of profound neglect, and how a breathtaking monument to hope slowly, tragically, became a tomb for thousands of forgotten souls. It's the story of how men and women, brought there for healing, were instead subjected to brutal treatments and a life of confinement. This is the story of how the architecture of hope became a century of horror. Section 1. A Palace for the Mind. To truly understand the depth of the tragedy that unfolded at Fergus Falls, you first have to understand the beauty of the dream. And to understand the dream, you have to understand the man behind it. Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride. A 19th century Philadelphia physician, Kirkbride was a man possessed by a belief that was nothing short of revolutionary. He believed that the very design of a building, its layout, its materials, its relationship with nature, could be a primary form of therapy. His philosophy, which would become known as the Kirkbride Plan, was a radical, compassionate departure from the squalid basements, grim almshouses, and jail cells where the mentally ill were so often hidden away, chained, and forgotten. Kirkbride didn't just envision hospitals. He envisioned temples of healing. His designs were sprawling, majestic, and meticulously planned to create an environment of peace and order. He called for a grand, central administration building, flanked by long, staggered wings that radiated outwards like a bird in flight. This specific bat-wing shape was crucial. It ensured that every single patient's room had an exterior window, granting them maximum access to natural light and cross-ventilation. Kirkbride believed that sunlight and fresh air were medicine. The grounds surrounding these buildings were just as important. They were to be beautifully landscaped, complete with farms, gardens, and workshops. This wasn't merely about aesthetics. It was the core of moral treatment. This was a structured regimen of purposeful, gentle activity designed to restore a patient's sense of dignity, purpose, and self-worth. The Fergus Falls facility, brought to life by the architect Warren B. Dunnell, is often described as one of the last, largest, and most complete examples of Kirkbride's vision ever built in the United States. It was an architectural marvel. Its striking red-tiled tower soared into the sky, a beacon of hope visible for miles across the rural Minnesota landscape. The structure itself was immense, stretching for nearly a third of a mile, its sheer scale almost impossible to take in with a single glance. It was, by all accounts, a masterpiece. More than that, it was a declaration in brick and mortar. A statement that society would no longer cast its most vulnerable citizens aside to languish in darkness. It was a solemn promise that here, within these sunlit, airy corridors, a broken mind could finally be made whole again. Section 2. Cracks in the foundation. But that beautiful, sun-drenched promise began to crumble almost as soon as the doors were unlocked. The foundation of the dream was sound, but the foundation of the system was not. At the time, Minnesota's other asylums in St. Peter and Rochester were already catastrophically overcrowded, filled to bursting with people the state didn't know what to do with. The brand new, magnificent hospital in Fergus Falls was seen not just as a beacon of hope, but as a desperately needed pressure valve. It was the solution to a problem that was already out of control. Just one day after the first two men arrived, carefully selected to inaugurate the new era of care, the hospital received 80 more patients. They were not gently introduced. They were transferred en masse from the St. Peter institution. They were mostly poor farmers and laborers, men sent by court order, diagnosed with conditions ranging from melancholy to exhaustion. For many, this transfer was the final stop, with little hope of ever leaving. The building, in its grand scale, was initially designed to house around 1,000 patients. It seemed like an enormous number, an impossible capacity to fill. But the flood of humanity was relentless. Society, it turned out, was all too eager to find a place for its undesirables, the difficult, the different, the inconvenient. The new hospital was the perfect destination. By the late 1920s, the hospital's population had swelled to around 1,700 patients. By 1937, it reached its staggering, suffocating peak. 2,078 patients. This was more than double its intended capacity. Imagine that. Kirkbride's grand architectural vision for light and air was being literally suffocated by the sheer mass of bodies. Corridors designed for quiet contemplation became crowded and loud. Private rooms intended for one became dormitories for 3 or 4. The very air, meant to be therapeutic, grew thick and stale. The institution became notoriously, dangerously understaffed, with just a handful of nurses and attendants responsible for hundreds of patients at a time. The dream of moral treatment, of patient-individualized care, dissolved under the immense, crushing pressure of just trying to maintain basic order. The noble focus on healing shifted out of necessity to control. Therapy devolved into confinement. The beautiful building, designed with such precision to be a cure, was slowly, inexorably becoming a warehouse for human beings. Section 3. A prison of neglect. For the more than 40,000 patients who passed through its doors over its 115-year history, the magnificent architecture became a cruel, mocking joke. The bare, unadorned facade, intended to bring a sense of discipline and tranquility to a troubled mind, became a symbol of stark punishment. The long, sunlit corridors, designed for quiet reflection and peaceful walks, became chaotic, unpredictable, and often dangerous spaces. The palace for the mind had become a prison of neglect. The patients who filled these halls were the poor and the marginalized of society. They were immigrants struggling with a new language and culture, laborers broken by relentless work, and countless individuals, mostly women, simply deemed a burden for their families, for reasons as flimsy as exhaustion, grief, or defiance. Many were locked away for life, with little legal recourse and no voice to fight for them. The promise of purposeful activity, the very heart of moral treatment, devolved into a system of forced, unpaid labor. Patients' own letters and complaints show they didn't feel they were being healed by the work. They felt it was simply chores. The hospital's sprawling farm, intended as a place of therapeutic connection to the land, became little more than a work camp. In fact, it was among the very last institutional farms of its kind in Minnesota to be shut down, amid growing national concerns about the blatant exploitation of patient labor. As the decades wore on and overcrowding worsened, the treatment philosophies grew darker and more desperate. The gentle approach of Kirkbride gave way to more invasive physical interventions. Hospital records show that staff began using electroshock therapy in 1939, and later, lobotomies. These brutal procedures were often performed without adequate consent, on patients who had no power to refuse, and with little true understanding of their devastating long-term consequences. The core of the treatment philosophy became complete isolation from the outside world. The asylum transformed into a place where society could forget about its problems, and where families could, and often did, forget about their relatives. The staff, too, were victims of this failing system. They were not villains, but people trapped in an impossible situation. Chronically overwhelmed and perpetually understaffed, they were forced into the role of guards rather than caregivers. Their own records reveal a constant struggle with safety concerns, patient violence born of frustration and confinement, and the immense, soul-crushing burnout that came from working day after day in an environment of such profound despair. They were trapped inside the decaying dream, every bit as much as the patients they were supposed to be healing. Section 4. The Cemetery of Numbers. Perhaps nothing illustrates the complete and utter failure of the hospital's original mission more starkly, more chillingly, than what lies just beyond the main building. There, in a quiet, unassuming field, is the hospital cemetery. It is the final resting place for thousands of people who lived and died at the institution between its opening in 1890 and the late 1960s. Walk through that field, and you will find no comforting angels, no poetic epitaphs, no loving inscriptions. There are no names on most of the graves. There are no dates of birth or death. There are only simple, cold, wrought iron stakes, each one pounded into the earth and marked with a number. 314, 1027, 2551. Thousands of lives, each one unique, filled with its own hopes, fears, and memories, were reduced to a serial number. It was the final, horrifying act of erasure. These were people who were forgotten by society in life, and in death, their very identities were stripped away, cast aside like a worn-out file. In this field of numbers, it was as if they had never existed at all. Each numbered stake is a silent, damning testament to the true human cost of the Kirkbride dream. It is a final, cold rebuttal to the beautiful idea that magnificent architecture could ever be enough to overcome a system of neglect. Section 5. The long, slow death. The end for the Fergus Falls State Hospital and for the entire era of the Grand Asylum came not with a dramatic bang, but with a slow, agonizing whimper that stretched across decades. The 1950s ushered in a sea change in mental health care with the advent of psychotropic medications like Thorazine. For the first time, there was a chemical means of managing symptoms, which fueled a new philosophy of deinstitutionalization. The prevailing belief was that the massive, isolated institutions had failed, and that patients would be better served and have a better quality of life in smaller, community-based facilities. And so, the great emptying began. Slowly, cautiously, the population of the massive hospital began to decline from its peak of over 2,000. For decades, patients were gradually moved out, either to smaller group homes, back to their families, or, in some tragic cases, onto the streets. Finally, in 2005, the Fergus Falls Regional Treatment Center, as it was then known, officially closed its patient services. The entire sprawling property was transferred to the city of Fergus Falls in 2007. The magnificent structure, which had once been the region's largest employer and a massive source of civic pride, was now empty, a silent giant. For the symbolic price of $1, the small city inherited a masterpiece and a ruin. The architecture of hope fell silent. The sun, which had been so central to its design, still streamed through the thousands of windows. But now, it no longer illuminated bustling corridors of healing. It illuminated only peeling paint, dust-filled, empty hallways, and the palpable ghosts of a failed utopia. The building, once a symbol of Minnesota's future, was now a relic of its past, left to sit and slowly decay. Section 6. A legacy in ruins. In the years since its closure, the hospital has become something it never was in life, a source of deep and bitter division. For architectural historians and preservationists, it remains one of the last largely intact Kirkbride buildings in the entire country, a priceless, irreplaceable piece of American history that is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. But for the small city of Fergus Falls, it has been an almost unbearable burden, a financial and emotional anchor. Over the years, numerous redevelopment efforts have been proposed, each one promising to breathe new life into the old structure. Proposals for luxury hotels, sprawling apartment complexes, and vibrant art centers have all come and gone. Each one ultimately collapsed under the staggering, astronomical cost of renovating such a colossal and neglected structure. The city eventually concluded that waiting for a single wealthy developer with impossibly deep pockets was a fool's errand, and that local taxpayers could no longer be asked to support the costly maintenance of the empty property. And so, the wrecking ball has finally arrived. Phased demolition of the massive wings has begun. The city has sought millions of dollars in state funding, not to save the building, but to tear it down. The current plan, a heartbreaking compromise for some, would leave only the iconic Central Administration Tower standing, a lone Gothic spire surrounded by a vast field of rubble, a tombstone for the building itself. Preservationists see this as an act of cultural vandalism, the willful destruction of an irreplaceable landmark. Others, including many locals, see it as the necessary removal of a painful, costly reminder of a dark past, a final step in moving forward. Conclusion. The story of the Fergus Falls State Hospital is a profound tragedy written in stone, glass, and decaying plaster. It stands today as a powerful and deeply heartbreaking monument to a beautiful idea. The idea that we could, through thoughtful design and compassion, build our way to a better, more humane world. But it's also a monument to a profound failure. A failure of funding, which starved the dream before it could ever truly take root. A failure of medicine, which for decades offered confinement instead of a cure. And most importantly, a failure of society to truly care for its most vulnerable citizens, choosing instead to lock them away behind a beautiful facade. In the end, the most vital and enduring lesson from this decaying palace may be the simplest one. As one historian who studied these institutions noted, architecture was supposed to cure them, but architecture can't fix neglect. Today, the building sits in limbo, part historical treasure, part community burden, part ruin. And it leaves us all with a lingering, difficult question. What do we owe these places of memory? Should we tear them down to erase the pain of the past? Or do we have a duty to preserve them, no matter how difficult or costly, as a solemn warning for the future? Thank you for joining us on this journey into a dark, but important chapter of our history. If you believe these stories need to be told, please consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think should become of the architecture of hope?